So I hope I am audible to everyone and you can see the screen. Uh, so as I told you, the second episode is going to be on cardiovascular system's most common end point of disease, that is cardiac failure. Almost all cardiac diseases finally end up in cardiac failure. So this is like a very common end point where most of the acute and chronic cardiac diseases will culminate. So let us discuss. As usual, we'll start with a few questions. Today's session is divided into three parts. The first part is the pathophysiology. The second part is a very brief overview of the drugs that we use to treat cardiac failure. Finally, the last part is the clinical management and the newer updates in the management of cardiac failure. So, with the first part, as we start, I'll present to you 5 MCQs, and as usual, I'll want all of you to participate. This is your first question. A 50-year-old man presented with fatigue, pedal edema, and ascites. On auscultation, his chest was clear. What is the most probable diagnosis? Okay, we'll move on to the second question. A forward feature of left heart failure is. Next question. Low cardiac output in presence of reduced venous return indicates heart failure. Whether the statement is true or false, you indicate by mentioning A or B. The next question. Cyanosis in left ventricular failure. Is it central, peripheral, both, or none? The final question before we start the discussion. All may be causes of high output heart failure except. So which one is not a cause of high output heart failure? Thank you for the responses. We'll now discuss the relevant portions and come back to these questions. The definition of cardiac failure is very interesting. So we have to understand why each and every word in this definition is very important. Let us assume a situation where the heart is not receiving any blood. Suppose there is a hypovolemia. If the heart is not receiving any blood, cardiac output will be low. But then we cannot blame the heart for pumping less blood because in the first place it did not receive the blood. But if the heart is receiving blood and in spite of that, it cannot contract properly to generate adequate cardiac output. Only then we can blame the heart for failing to do what it is supposed to do. That is why if the venous return is low, then it can be certain kinds of shock, but definitely not cardiac failure. Only when the venous return to the heart is normal or even elevated, cardiac failure can be diagnosed. So heart failure is a clinico-pathological condition where the heart cannot generate adequate cardiac output to meet the metabolic demands of the body in presence of a normal or elevated venous return. So it is not only a reduced cardiac output, it is also inability to meet the metabolic demands as well as presence of normal or elevated venous return that should be present in the clinical scenario to diagnose cardiac failure. I hope this part is clear to everyone. There are different ways in which heart failure can be classified. So heart failure can be classified into acute and chronic. Acute heart failure can develop over hours to days. For example, heart failure that happens in the setting of myocardial infarction. Or it can be chronic or a long-standing heart disease culminating into heart failure, something that typically happens in chronic valvular heart diseases. Like mitral regurgitation, aortic stenosis. Left-sided, right-sided, and biventricular is the anatomical classification. If the left ventricle fails, it is called left-sided heart failure. If the right side of the heart fails, it is called right-sided heart failure. And if both ventricles fail to pump blood, it is called biventricular heart failure. There is one old way of classifying cardiac failure. If the contractile function of the heart is predominantly compromised, we call it systolic failure. And if the relaxation function of the heart is compromised so that blood cannot be received, it is called diastolic heart failure. These two terminologies have been revised in the modern time. In systolic failure, because the pumping or the ejection of blood is less, so systolic failure is also called heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. Conversely, in diastolic failure, the heart fails to receive the blood. That is why the cardiac output is less. Otherwise, its ejection fraction, that is the fraction of blood it pumps, is normal. So, as the total blood is less, so the fraction becomes less. So, that is known as heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Now, heart failure can also be classified based on the cardiac output. If the cardiac output is low, lower than normal, it is called low output heart failure. And quite obviously, most of the heart failure will be low output. That is what the definition suggests. But there is also one type of heart failure known as high output heart failure. High output heart failure means that the value of the cardiac output is high, but in spite of that, there is heart failure. This is because if you remember the definition of heart failure, the cardiac output should fail to meet the metabolic demands of the body. So if the metabolic demands of the body has increased abnormally, then even a high cardiac output may not be able to meet the demand. So high output heart failure typically happens in condition where the metabolic rate is higher than normal. This typically happens in thyrotoxicosis, pheochromocytoma. These are all associated with increased metabolism, either due to increased thyroxine or increased catecholamines. In pregnancy, where the mother's heart is meeting the demand of two organisms. In beriberi, where there is deficiency of the energy yielding vitamin thiamine. As a result, cellular oxidation suffers and we need more oxygen for the same amount of ATP production. Or in other rare conditions like arteriovenous shunt. where the heart is pumping blood, but due to the shunt or abnormal pathway, it's not reaching the tissue. A similar condition can also happen in severe anemia, where the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood decreases. As a result, although the amount of blood is high, but the metabolic demand cannot be met. So these are important causes of high output cardiac failure. In all other causes, the cardiac output is usually low. So low output cardiac failure is the usual cardiac failure. Now we come to another very important classification. This can be seen as classification of the symptoms of heart failure, which we call forward failure and backward failure. And based on the forward and backward failure, we will discuss the clinical features of heart failure. Now, to understand the concept of forward failure and backward failure, we have to consider a very simple circuit diagram of the circulatory system. Let us first create that. So, let us assume that this is the heart with the four chambers, a schematic representation of the four chambers of the heart. Now, as we know that from this heart, from the left ventricle, blood comes out and goes to different parts of the body. After supplying oxygen and nutrients from different parts of the body, this same blood will return, and this will return to the right atrium. From right atrium, it goes to right ventricle, and from right ventricle, it goes for oxygenation to the lungs. After oxygenation, the oxygenated blood from the lungs will return to the left atrium, then to the left ventricle, and the circuit will be completed. So this is a very simple oversimplified diagram. If I name the vessels that connect them, then from left ventricle to the body, we have aorta and its branches. From body to the right atrium, we have the superior and inferior vena cava. From the right ventricle to the lungs, we have the pulmonary trunk or pulmonary artery. And from the lungs back to the left heart, we have the pulmonary vein. So with this very simple scheme of circulation that we can all understand, we can easily explain the clinical features of heart failure. Understand that when one chamber of the heart cannot pump, two things will happen simultaneously. The blood that is supposed to go forward will not go, and the blood that is supposed to enter the heart from behind will not enter, because the whole ventricle is already filled and there is no space for new blood. So the blood that is supposed to go forward will not go and produce some features, and these are the forward features. And the blood that was supposed to come from behind will not come. That will cause a few features. These are the backward features. So let us see step by step what would be the forward and backward features in right and left ventricular failure. Let us start. Let us start with the left ventricular failure. In left ventricular failure, as I told you, two things will happen simultaneously. On one hand, there will be reduced forward flow of blood. So the branches of the aorta will not get sufficient blood, and we can now describe the symptoms of lack of blood according to the supply of aorta. So there will be less blood in the extremities, and this will lead to pallor or pale color. This will also lead to peripheral cyanosis or bluish discoloration. There will be less blood going into coronary arteries. You know, these are the first branches of aorta. and this will lead to angina or chest pain. There will be less blood going into the kidney. This will result in oliguria or less urine formation, low GFR. Less blood will go to the brain, and this will typically present as confusion or dizziness. In this way, different symptomatologies will appear because of lack of blood to important tissues, and all these symptoms will be together known as the forward features of left ventricular failure, because they were due to lack of blood in the forward flow. Again, talking about the backward part, there will be accumulation of blood in left ventricle. The accumulation of blood in left ventricle makes the left ventricle filled. So there is left ventricular congestion. Congestion means it's filled with blood. As blood fills up the left ventricle, gradually blood will backflow and the blood from left atrium cannot come. So left atrium will also be congested after some time. So you keep going backwards step by step. So this will be followed by left atrial congestion. After the whole of the left atrium is filled with blood, a time will come when blood from the pulmonary vein can no longer enter the left atrium. So now there will be pulmonary venous congestion. So pressure in the pulmonary vein will rise. As the vein becomes turgid with blood, just before the vein comes the capillary. So now the pulmonary capillary pressure will rise. So there will be rise in pulmonary capillary pressure, also known as pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. As the capillary pressure rises, now something interesting will happen. Capillaries are exchange vessels. So the capillaries have minute openings through which fluid can go out or come in. As the pressure in the capillary rises, there is leakage of fluid, also called transudation. So there will be transudation of fluid into the alveoli and interstitial tissue of lung. This excess fluid in the alveolus and interstitial tissue is known as pulmonary edema. So this leads to pulmonary edema. Pulmonary edema will typically present with cough, breathlessness, and because due to the high pressure, some vessels rupture, the blood and the sputum mixes, and this causes a pink frothy sputum. And these features, the features of left ventricular congestion, the features of left atrial congestion, pulmonary venous congestion, rise in the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, all these features together will be called the backward features of left ventricular failure. Because they are caused by backward accumulation of blood. So I hope you understand what is the concept of forward failure and backward failure. Lack of blood in front causes the forward features, and excess of blood behind the chamber causes the backward features. Is this clear to everyone? Then I'll move on to the features of right ventricular failure. Wonderful. So in the right ventricular failure, we can again create an algorithm very similar to this. In right ventricular failure, there will be reduced blood flow in front of the right ventricle, and also there will be accumulation of blood behind the right ventricle. So there will be reduced blood flow into, if you see the diagram, into the pulmonary artery. And also there will be right ventricular congestion. After the whole of the right ventricle becomes totally filled, then the right atrium will become congested. So there will be right atrial congestion. After the right atrium is filled with blood, you can see from the diagram, blood will start accumulating in the inferior and superior vena cava. So there will be superior and inferior vena caval congestion. Now we know that the inferior vena cava supplies below the diaphragm and superior vena cava above the diaphragm. So organs below and above the diaphragm will start gradually getting congested with blood and they will swell up. Due to obstruction of the inferior vena cava, there will be features like pedal edema or swelling of the legs. As you move upwards, there will be features like hepatomegaly, splenomegaly, and fluid in the abdomen, that is ascites. Due to superior vena caval congestion, blood from the head and neck region will not be able to drain properly, and this will lead to engorged neck veins. There will be engorgement of the internal and external jugular veins because blood from the head and neck region cannot come back. They're all filled with blood. In very severe cases, the fluid from the pleura and pericardium will also not be able to come, causing pleural effusion, that is fluid in pleural sac, and pericardial effusion. So the backward features of right ventricular failure, in summary, will be systemic edema. That is edema of different parts of the body, but not lungs. Lungs will not be affected in right ventricular failure. So there will be systemic edema, and these are the features of backward failure in right ventricular failure. The features of forward failure are not very prominent in case of right ventricular failure, partly because the pressure in the pulmonary circulation is very low. So you need very little force to push the blood forward. Second, because if less blood goes to the lung, ultimately less blood comes back to the left part of the heart. So the symptoms are shared with the features of left ventricular failure. So in summary, these are the clinical features. One thing that deserves mention here is that as the lung becomes filled with fluid in left ventricular failure, this will impair oxygen transport. So the pulmonary edema will ultimately cause reduced oxygen intake or hypoxia. And these hypoxia can cause desaturation of the hemoglobin and later lead to cyanosis. When cyanosis is caused at the level of the lungs, it is called central cyanosis. And when it is caused by reduced circulation, it is called peripheral cyanosis. So this is an example of central cyanosis because it is the gas exchange which is the culprit and not circulation. And in left ventricular forward feature, the cyanosis is peripheral because it is the circulation that is the culprit and not the gas exchange. So in left ventricular failure, the cyanosis that happens is a combination of both peripheral cyanosis as well as central cyanosis. Are these clinical features clear to everyone? Then I'll move on to the next section. Very good. So if we see in summary, therefore, right-sided backward failure causes vena cava congestion, congestion of the liver, ascites, and pleural effusion. Left-sided backward failure causes pulmonary venous congestion and pulmonary edema. The forward failures ultimately cause weakness, pallor, peripheral cyanosis, angina, and oliguria. This is how the chest X-ray would look like in pulmonary edema or cardiogenic pulmonary edema. If you see this very carefully, you should be able to notice that there are very fine opaque lines that you can see near the hilum. These are the congested veins. The veins have become congested. If I label the veins for you, they will look like this. So the veins are radiating out like this in bundles because of the backward congestion. These are the apical lobe veins. These are the middle lobe veins. Also, you can see there is a little bit of interstitial edema here and there in the tissue of the lung. Overall, this mimics as if a bat is standing with the wings expanded. So sometimes this has been called the bat wing appearance of chest X-ray. So when the lung fields have a bat wing-like appearance, an approximate bat wing, we understand that the veins have engorged, and therefore this will represent a cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Also, another very interesting finding is you can see the whiteness, that is the congestion, is more at the base than at the top. This is due to the effect of gravity, that blood accumulates more at the bottom than at the top. So you get more congestion in the lower lobes of the lung than in the upper lobes of the lung in upright posture of the patient. Moving on to the next clinical features, I spoke about cyanosis, and cyanosis is typically examined on skin and mucosa. You can see in this lady, the lips and the tongue are bluish in color, and also the tip of the fingers are bluish in color. These are the signs of central and peripheral cyanosis. You can see here, it is labeled with a black arrow. There is a prominent vein here. This is the external jugular vein. Although conventionally, we always try to look at the internal jugular vein. These are the two heads of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Internal jugular vein usually lies in the triangle formed by the two heads of sternomastoid. And the height of the venous prominence should be measured vertically from the sternal angle. So this is how venous engorgement is measured. Engorged neck vein indicates right ventricular failure. This is pedal edema. So if you press the leg, you will see there is an indentation or pitting, indicating that there is fluid in the interstitial tissue. The classical way of eliciting edema is to press over the medial malleolus for about 20 seconds and see if the indentation mark remains there. So these are the common features of left and right ventricular failure. We'll now discuss what kind of compensatory mechanism the body undergoes during the process of left ventricular failure. Now, as we have seen that in left ventricular failure, there is reduced cardiac output. Because of the reduced cardiac output, there is less blood supply to all important organs. We will now focus on two important organs that participate in the neural and hormonal mechanisms. So there is reduced blood flow to the brain that we can call cerebral hypoperfusion. There is also reduced blood supply to the kidney, which we can call renal hypoperfusion. Whenever there is reduced blood supply to the brain, this ischemic response causes sympathetic overactivity. So there is sympathetic overactivity. The peripheral sympathetic discharge increases. Whenever there is renal hypoperfusion, it stimulates the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And on the juxtaglomerular apparatus, there is beta adrenergic receptor that gets stimulated. Stimulation of the beta 1 receptor can also happen directly due to the sympathetic overactivity. Whatever be the cause of stimulation, stimulation of the juxtaglomerular cell causes release of an enzyme called renin. Hypo means less, perfusion means blood flow. So hypoperfusion means reduced blood flow. So stimulation of the beta 1 receptor causes release of an enzyme called renin. Do not confuse renin for a hormone. Renin is actually not a hormone. It is an enzyme that acts on plasma proteins, generating new hormones. Now, this renin, as I told you, is a proteolytic enzyme, and it converts a large protein called angiotensinogen into a smaller fragment called angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is inactive. Angiotensin 1 is converted into its active form, angiotensin 2, by the enzyme angiotensin converting enzyme. Which is present liberally on the endothelial surface in all parts of the body and dominantly present in lungs and kidney. Now, this angiotensin 2 has several functions. So, angiotensin 2 itself can cause vasoconstriction, fluid retention. It can cause increased aldosterone, which again causes fluid retention, and it can also increase antidiuretic hormone, which again causes vasoconstriction and water retention. So the net effect of the activation of the renin-angiotensin system is a process of fluid overload. Ultimately, all of them cause a state of fluid overload and vasoconstriction. So this being the mechanism, we have to understand how does this mechanism help. Honestly speaking, we should not be thinking teleologically. It is not necessary that all mechanisms help our body. So these are certain evolutionary mechanisms that have been conserved in us, not always proving to be helpful. In a way, the fluid overload initially helps. It increases the end diastolic volume, and by Frank Stirling's principle, the cardiac output increases. But remember, Frank Stirling's law operates only within a physiological limit. When that physiological limit is crossed, then instead of increasing the cardiac output, it will decrease the cardiac output. So what becomes beneficial in the beginning becomes harmful in the end. There is one more adverse effect of activation of this system. The molecules angiotensin 2 and aldosterone, apart from their vasoconstriction and fluid retention ability, have another very harmful effect, which is called cardiac remodeling. This is a mechanism where the normal heart cells are converted into abnormal, stiff, fibrous tissue. So gradually, the contractile heart becomes a hard mass like a leather bag, and it can no longer contract or relax. That is why it is very important to prevent the renin-angiotensin system activation in the long run. Luckily, we have a few targets where the different drugs can work, and these drugs can prove to be useful here. The sympathetic overactivity and the beta 1 receptor stimulation can be blocked by a beta blocker. That is why beta blockers are very useful in chronic heart failure. The activity of renin can be blocked by a very novel drug, the renin antagonist called aliskiren. The enzyme angiotensin converting enzyme can be inhibited by a group of drugs known as ACE inhibitors like enalapril, lisinopril or ramipril. Effect of excess aldosterone can be counteracted by using aldosterone antagonists like spironolactone or triamterene. Effect of excess ADH can be counteracted by ADH antagonist like tolvaptan. The effect of angiotensin 2 can be directly blocked by drugs called angiotensin receptor blockers like losartan or valsartan. Other than these, there are some very novel drugs that has been discovered nowadays, but these are the very basic few drugs that can be used. Also, the fluid overload can be directly contraindicated, can be counteracted by using diuretics. So these are the various drugs that can inhibit the neurohumoral activation and in the long run prevent cardiac fibrosis and remodeling. Okay. So I hope this is clear to you. Now, there are three types of breathlessness that we see in cardiac failure. In cardiac failure, there may be pulmonary edema or pleural effusion that can cause breathlessness. Breathlessness is synonymous with the word dyspnea. Dysp means disturbed or difficult, and pnea means breathing. So, any difficult breathing is dyspnea. Next, sometimes we see that patients experience breathlessness while lying down, but when they sit up, then the breathlessness goes away. This phenomenon is called orthopnea. Ortho means posture. So, a breathlessness that typically happens in lying position but is relieved on upright position is orthopnea. So, there is breathlessness in supine position, relieved in upright position. This is explained by the fact that when we lie down, the effect of gravity is nullified, so more blood goes to the lung. The venous return increases. As a result, the pulmonary edema also increases. When you stand up or sit up, the effect of gravity starts working. As a result, the blood is pooled in the peripheral tissue, venous return decreases, and the pulmonary congestion also decreases. Something very interesting which we see in some patients is paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea. This is not exactly same as orthopnea. So what are the criteria of PND? The criteria are that the patient goes to sleep without breathlessness. Second, the patient wakes up about 3 to 4 hours after sleep due to sudden onset severe breathlessness. And thirdly, what differentiates this from orthopnea is that the breathlessness is not relieved simply on sitting upright. So what causes paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea? There are a number of theories that explain why PND might occur. One explanation is that when a person is sleeping, during sleep, the sympathetic tone decreases. and this causes reduced contractility of the heart and suddenly decompensates the heart failure. The second mechanism that has been proposed is that during sleep there is increased venous return, as we already saw. This causes congestion of the bronchial vessels. These congested bronchial vessels press on the bronchus, causing bronchospasm. So the patient has asthma-like features. There will be asthma-like features. Finally, another theory says that the bronchial smooth muscle has a circadian rhythm. So the muscle has a tendency to contract during night and relax during the morning. As a result, at night, there is a greater chance of asthma or any other breathless condition like cardiac failure to aggravate. So whatever be the cause, you can understand the cause is not simply related to lying down or posture. That is why it is not relieved simply on sitting up. It has to be treated as an emergency like an acute cardiac failure. I hope up to this is clear. I have already received two questions. One question is to explain heart failure with Frank Sterling's law, which I shall do shortly. And another question is that whether diuretics reduce only fluid overload, which I will address in the second part of the discussion where we discuss the drugs. So up to this, is this clear to everyone? Now coming to explanation of cardiac failure with the help of Frank Sterling's curve. Understanding the treatment of heart failure using Frank Sterling's curve is very interesting. So listen very carefully. We know that slope of this curve represents the contractility. So if there is heart failure, the slope of the new curve will be much less. Let's assume now in a failing heart, the slope becomes like this. Now, let us understand step by step what happens in this patient with heart failure. Follow very meticulously. Let us think that this is the operating point, that is the normal point at which the patient's heart operates. We all have a normal value of preload and afterload. If this is the normal operating point, then as usual, let's draw perpendiculars. So for a given person, this must be the normal cardiac output C1, and this must be the normal end diastolic volume in the resting state, suppose E1. Now, due to some disease like myocardial infarction, the contractility suddenly drops. By definition, that means that at the same preload, cardiac output decreases. We can see how much it has decreased. It has decreased to this new operating point now. If you drop a perpendicular from here, you can easily understand how much there has been a decrease in the cardiac output. This is the fall in the cardiac output. And this is the new cardiac output, C2. As the new cardiac output is less, so compensatory mechanisms will start to operate. There will be activation of renin-angiotensin system, activation of sympathetic nervous system, and activation of the ADH, because of which there will be accumulation of fluid. As fluid increases in the body, end diastolic volume also increases. So gradually the preload increases. As the preload increases, the operating point also starts moving. And as it moves to some optimum point, you can see easily that after reaching this point, there has been some improvement in the cardiac output, but it has not been totally compensated. This is what we mean by compensated heart failure, that the increase in fluid has to some extent managed the cardiac output but could not go to the normal level. Now, because it did not go back to the normal level, so the renin-angiotensin, ADH and sympathetic activity will keep on happening because the set point of the body is not reached. As it keeps on happening, so fluid overloading keeps on happening. But unfortunately, this will push the heart into the non-physiological part of the Frank-Starling's curve. So by the time patient has come to you, the patient's operating point is in the downward slope. So you have a persistently low cardiac output, but the low cardiac output is in presence of, you can easily see, a high venous return or high preload. And that is the definition of heart failure. A low cardiac output in presence of an normal or even increased preload or venous return. And that is heart failure. So now, what is the goal of our therapy? The goal of our therapy is to make the person normal. So this is the pathological point P where we are, and this is the normal point N where we should be. Let us understand how much journey we have to undertake. So we have to undertake a long journey, starting from P down to N. Just a minute. So this is the journey that you have to undertake. Recall your old days lessons of vectors. So this line can be wonderfully resolved into an x component and a y component. We can call them the treatment vectors. What does the x component indicate? The x component indicates a decrease in the preload. What does it mean? Decrease in fluid. So this is where diuretics come into play. What does the y component mean? Increase in slope. And what is the slope? Contractility. So which drug will increase the slope? The positive inotropic agents. So this is how diuretics and positive inotropes, they will not only reduce the fluid volume, they will also help in improving the cardiac function by shifting the operating point back to the normal. Vasodilator drugs can act both ways. The vasodilators cause peripheral accumulation of blood and therefore reduce the preload. The arterial dilators reduce afterload and therefore increase the cardiac output. So this is the graphical analysis of cardiac failure. If you have understood this, it's very good. If not, you can leave this portion to be seen again and again in the YouTube videos, and I'm sure you will understand. Let us go to the pharmacological management now. But before that, we should be able to answer the questions that we started with. Let us start with the first question. So what will be the answer to this question? A 50-year-old man presented with fatigue, pedal edema, ascites. On auscultation, his chest was clear. That means there is no pulmonary edema. So what is the probable diagnosis? Very good. It is totally symptomatic of right ventricular failure. Next question. A forward feature of left heart failure is? Very good, pallor. Next question. Low cardiac output in presence of reduced venous return indicates heart failure. True or false? Wonderful. The answer is false because the venous return needs to be normal or elevated. Cyanosis in left ventricular failure is? Very good. It is both central and peripheral. All may be causes of high output heart failure except, which is not a cause of high output heart failure. The answer is A, chronic aortic stenosis. Beriberi, thyrotoxicosis, and anemia are all causes of high output heart failure. In aortic stenosis, aortic outflow tract is narrow and therefore less blood comes out. It is not possible for it to be high output. Now moving on to the next section, that is drugs used in cardiac failure. So read this question carefully. A heart failure patient with pedal edema, ascites, breathlessness has a serum sodium of 125. For the first year students, this is a low level of sodium. Normal level is 135 to 145. So the sodium level is 125 milliequivalent per liter. What is the ideal drug to treat the congestive symptoms? Next question. False about sacubitril is. It is a neprilysin stimulator. It increases plasma level of natriuretic peptide. It promotes diuresis and natriuresis. It is used in combination with valsartan. Next question. Levosimendan acts by all except calcium sensitization, increased cytosolic calcium, phosphodiesterase 3 inhibition, and vasodilation. Next question. Ivabradine causes bradycardia, reduced contractility, reduced ventricular filling, or all of the above. Finally, serum potassium level needs to be monitored during digoxin therapy, ACE inhibitor therapy, spironolactone therapy, or all of the above. Okay, let us get into the discussion and we'll come back to these questions very soon. Now, what are the different drugs that are used in heart failure? We have diuretics like furosemide or metolazone. All of them cause loss of sodium and water from the body, which is called natriuresis and diuresis. So, diuretics have one very basic principle of action. They remove water and sodium from the body. So, the venous return decreases. So, the end diastolic volume decreases. And you remember, the heart failure patient is in the non-physiological part of the Frank-Starling's curve. So, decrease in preload will cause improvement of the cardiac output. It will go backwards. So, that is how cardiac performance increases. Vasodilators reduce preload and afterload. As a result, preload reduction causes improved cardiac performance. Afterload reduction directly increases cardiac output. Inotropic agents we have seen in the previous episode also, they directly or indirectly increase calcium in the heart. As a result, the contractility increases and slope of the Frank-Starling's curve also improves. And the drugs that inhibit the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis, like the ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, aldosterone antagonists, and beta blockers, they prevent cardiac remodeling. There are some new drugs based on which I had set a few questions. These new drugs are very novel targets. But remember, the older drugs are also the gold standard drugs. We always start with the older drugs because we know about their efficacy and adverse effect better than the newer ones. The newer ones are either in trial or has been very recently approved. Now, in our body, during the neurohumoral activation, one more thing happens. We have seen that in backward failure, there is congestion of different chambers of heart. The congestion of atria cause release of a molecule called brain natriuretic peptide or B-type natriuretic peptide. So there is release of, at first, a molecule called proBNP, which then modifies into BNP or the B-type natriuretic peptide. The function of this B-type natriuretic peptide is to cause sodium and water elimination. So it removes sodium and water through kidney. So it works very much like a diuretic. And by working like that, it causes reduced preload. And in the setting of heart failure, reduced preload means improved cardiac output because we are operating in the non-physiological part. Now, since BNP has a diuretic-like action, so we can create artificial BNP molecule by recombinant DNA technology. And we have been able to reproduce this molecule. The artificially created recombinant BNP is known as nesiritide. It can be given as an infusion in severe congestive cardiac failure. Also, the molecule BNP is metabolized by a group of enzymes, and this enzyme is the neprilysin. So if you inhibit the neprilysin, the lifespan of BNP molecule increases. It works for a longer time, removes more water and sodium, and so there is further reduction in preload. We have seen that digoxin or inamrinone or milrinone, they increase the calcium ion concentration in the myocardium. However, the drug levosimendan does not increase calcium level. Levosimendan simply increases the sensitivity of troponin C to calcium. As a result, even without increasing calcium level, it increases the contractility of the heart. So Jui Power is asking, cardiac output is directly proportional to preload, then how does reduced preload improve cardiac output? I think you were following right a few minutes before when I said that in heart failure, the operating point is pushed to the downward slope of the Frank-Starling's curve, which is not the physiological curve. And the slope of the curve is negative, which means increase in preload causes decreased cardiac output. Because a failing heart operates on the downsloping part of the cardiac function curve, so decrease in preload causes improvement of cardiac output. You can go through this video again and again in the YouTube, and I think this portion will be clear. Ivabradine is a funny channel inhibitor. It inhibits the funny sodium current. As a result, it decreases the heart rate. But as it decreases the heart rate, understand, then the diastolic duration increases because the cardiac cycle duration increases. If the diastolic duration increases, two things happen. One, workload of the heart decreases because the heart rate is less. Two, ventricle gets more time to fill. So by Frank-Starling's principle, cardiac output increases. So ivabradine does not directly increase the cardiac output, but by slowing down the heart, by inhibiting the funny current, it causes indirectly rest to the heart and also better ventricular filling. So I hope this is clear to everyone. Um, let us go back to the questions that we were discussing. So one question that we had is, a heart failure patient with pedal edema, ascites and breathlessness has come to you. Now evidently the patient has congestive symptom. So you need a water losing drug. But the serum sodium level is very low. So you have to choose a drug that selectively causes water loss without losing sodium. So what will be your drug of choice? Furosemide causes loss of sodium, potassium and water. Metolazone, being thiazide, causes loss of sodium, chloride and water. Tolvaptan, being ADH antagonist, loses only water. Spironolactone also causes loss of sodium, potassium and water. We don't want sodium to be lost from the body because the level is already low. So you choose a drug that selectively loses water and concentrates the sodium. So the answer here will be ADH antagonist tolvaptan. I hope this is clear. The next question falls about sacubitril. Sacubitril, you know, is a neprilysin inhibitor, not a neprilysin stimulator. It inhibits the enzyme neprilysin and thus it increases plasma level of the natriuretic peptide. And thus it promotes diuresis and natriuresis. And for additional vasodilator action, it is added with the ARB valsartan. So what will be false about sacubitril? Yes, the answer is A. It is neprilysin stimulator. That is a wrong statement. Levosimendan acts by all except. We already know how it works. It works by sensitizing troponin C to calcium. So it's a calcium sensitizing drug. It has two additional action. It also has a milrinone-like action. So it causes phosphodiesterase 3 inhibition. And by increasing cyclic AMP, it can also cause vasodilation. But what it of course does not cause is increased cytosolic calcium. That is the novelness of the drug. It increases calcium sensitivity but not the calcium amount. So B is the answer, that it does not act by increased cytosolic calcium. Ivabradine causes. What will be the right answer? Yes, very good. The answer will be A, bradycardia. By bradycardia, it improves ventricular filling, and by Frank Sterling's principle, that improves the cardiac output. So it has no direct action on contractility. It only affects the heart rate, and therefore it only causes bradycardia. Wonderful. Finally, serum potassium level needs to be monitored during. I think second year onward students should be able to answer this. So to guide you through this, digoxin and potassium antagonize each other's action. They oppose each other's action. As a result, during digoxin therapy, potassium level must be monitored. ACE inhibitor and spironolactone, both of them inhibit renin-angiotensin axis. Now, a function of the renin-angiotensin axis is potassium loss. So when these drugs are given, potassium levels gradually start increasing in the body. So there is hyperkalemia. So in these two therapies also, potassium level needs to be monitored. So the answer is D, all of the above. I think this part is clear to you. We go on to the last part, which is a very small section, updating the clinical management of a cardiac failure. Let's try this question. Which statement is true about left ventricular failure? Next question. Morphine is indicated in which type of heart failure? Next question. In a chronic heart failure patient with no fluid retention, what is the drug of choice? Next, in a chronic heart failure patient with reduced ejection fraction with atrial fibrillation, what is the inotropic agent of choice? The final question. In cardiac resynchronization therapy, left ventricle is stimulated by a lead placed over which part? Okay, so with this, we start the discussion of the final part, how to investigate and manage a case of cardiac failure. Now, you see, you'd always do some baseline test in a patient. You find out the complete hemogram because severe anemia can be a cause of heart failure. Do a chest x-ray to look for the bat wing appearance. Check the plasma glucose level to rule out diabetes mellitus. Serum creatinine urea usually rise in heart failure. The reason is known because in left heart failure there is reduced GFR. As glomerular filtration decreases, toxins accumulate in the body. So creatinine and urea will start accumulating. Sodium and potassium should be measured before any diuretic therapy. And the ECG can reveal any underlying hypertrophy or arrhythmia. The investigation of choice is echocardiography that can measure reduced ejection fraction, except in case of high output cardiac failure. Serum BNP or the N-terminal pro-BNP is an important biomarker of heart failure. We have already seen how it is produced. Lipid profile and thyroid profile rules out the comorbidities that can lead to heart failure. Once these evaluations have started, we will also start the treatment. Acute heart failure is an emergency. So you admit the patient and give moist oxygen inhalation to improve the oxygen saturation. Morphine is very useful in the treatment of only acute left-sided heart failure. In left heart failure, there is pulmonary edema and breathlessness. Morphine dilates the veins and reabsorbs the edema fluid. As a result, the breathlessness quickly subsides. Furosemide is a loop diuretic and it is a very miraculous drug that immediately causes fluid and water loss. It has one additional action of vasodilation that further acts in removing the pulmonary edema fluid. Vasodilators like nitroprusside or glyceryl trinitrate can cause preload reduction or afterload reduction. And inotropic agents like digoxin, milrinone, or inamrinone can improve the contractility of the heart. However, in chronic heart failure, treatment strategy is slightly different. Our aim is to preserve the ejection fraction at the same time prevent remodeling of the heart. In chronic heart failure, patients are classified according to the New York Heart Association breathlessness functional classification. Class 1 means there is no limitation of activity and there is no symptom of heart failure by ordinary physical activity. Class 2 means that the patient is comfortable at rest, but ordinary physical activity causes symptoms of heart failure. Class 3 means there is a severe limitation of physical activity and patient is unable to carry out ordinary activity. But however, the patient is comfortable at rest. Class 4 means patient is breathless even when at rest or sitting in a chair. Based on this functional classification, we classify the symptomatologies and guide the therapy of chronic heart failure. So this is a very simplified algorithm for the treatment of chronic heart failure. Once the diagnosis of heart failure is confirmed, you check for pulmonary edema and systemic edema. If there is feature of fluid retention, your drug of choice is a diuretic, like a thiazide or low-dose furosemide. If there is no evidence of edema, the drug of choice is ACE inhibitor or angiotensin receptor blocker. If you have to add a second drug, the second drug will be a beta blocker. And thereafter, to prevent the cardiac remodeling, you can add ARBs, aldosterone antagonist, and also for symptomatic relief, the vasodilators or inotropes. Some patients have irregular heartbeat that prevent effective ventricular filling. These irregular heartbeats can be controlled by implanting pacemakers. There are two types of pacemaking therapy for heart failure. One is called the ICD or implantable cardioverter defibrillator. So it will immediately recognize any arrhythmia in the heart and provide a stimulus to start the heart again. On the other hand, the second one is cardiac resynchronization therapy. Here we have 2 or 3 electrodes placed. One is in the right atrium, other is in the right ventricle, and the left ventricular electrode is on, that was the question, on the coronary sinus. They can recognize from minute to minute any kind of arrhythmia and therefore pace both the ventricles in such a manner that effective ventricular contraction can happen. So this in summary are the updates of cardiac failure management. Let us now try the questions and conclude. So which statement do you think is true about left ventricular failure? So in left ventricular failure, there is reduced glomerular filtration. So all nitrogenous toxins increase in blood. Creatinine increases, urea increases, and due to neurohumoral activation, BNP also increases. Ejection fraction or cardiac output decreases. So the answer is B, ejection fraction decreases. Morphine is indicated in what kind of heart failure? Wonderful. Acute left ventricular heart failure, particularly with cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Next, in a chronic heart failure patient with no fluid retention, what is your drug of choice? Thiazide, furosemide are diuretics. Nesiritide is a BNP analog, and ramipril is a ACE inhibitor. Wonderful. The answer is C, ramipril, because we know that in patients with no fluid retention, drug of choice is ACE inhibitor. In a chronic heart failure patient with reduced ejection fraction and atrial fibrillation, what is the inotropic agent of choice? Try to choose a drug that treats both heart failure and atrial fibrillation. And there is only one drug here that serves both the purpose. Very good. The answer is digoxin. Digoxin is a positive inotropic agent, but it also inhibits the AV node, causing termination of fast beating impulses of the atrial fibrillation. So digoxin is only indicated in systolic failure with atrial fibrillation. The last question, in cardiac resynchronization therapy, where is the left ventricular electrode placed? Wonderful. It is placed over the coronary sinus. So I know that one session is very insufficient to discuss cardiac failure, but the aim of this session is to stimulate your learning and focus on the areas that are commonly missed so that you can read on your own more and get your concepts cleared. So that was today's session. Vishnu, it's over to you now.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful session and time. I request everyone to please fill the post-event form, which will be sent on the chat box. So kindly fill the form, and you will be available for the certificate. I